Good news. Growing up in northern New Jersey, on special occasions, our family would pick up tasty deli sandwiches. Anybody else have a similar experience as kids? Yeah. So the favorite was referred to as a sloppy Joe. And I'm not talking about the ground beef hot sandwich with onions and tomato sauce on a hamburger roll. This sandwich consisted of turkey and roast beef and ham and Swiss cheese and coleslaw and Russian dressing and 3 huge pieces of really good Jewish rye bread. The sandwich would come tightly wrapped in like paper, like parchment that had actually been cut through so you could pick it up in paper. Frankly, it was a little bit of a messy sandwich. The challenge was to open one's mouth wide enough. So because the height of the sandwich was over 2 inches, right, just because of the pure volume of stuff on it. So we just heard this morning what I like to think of as the sloppy Joe sandwich of gospel stories. Open your mouths now. I should have started with that. No. So the anonymous gospel writer we know as Mark had a habit of beginning one story, interrupting it with another story, then returning to the first story. It's a technique that we call sandwiching. Today, it was the ruckus in the temple, sandwiched between the leafy fig tree and the withered fig tree. An unusual approach, I suspect, to reinforce for those listening that something really pivotal had happened. However, Mark's not around, or whoever wrote that, to ask. So I want to ask you today to take a moment and imagine walking. A lot of us walk, right? Short walk, 120 miles, probably takes the better part of a week, just to celebrate Passover in a crowded temple in Jerusalem with thousands of other people. Why? Like, why? Because 3 times a year, pilgrims traveled to Jerusalem. And I realized, as Christians, we don't really have a good sense of the temple. Well, actually, we've got the sense of the temple that we've seen, right? Movies. So don't think of the temple as church-like, because it really wasn't a place of hushed reverence. Then again, this isn't either. It's very true. But I think we tend to overlay some of that experience onto the temple. The temple was more like a marvelous, massive complex of open-air courtyards, the size of maybe the equivalent of 12 soccer fields end to end. It was a tourist attraction. It was overcrowded. It was noisy. It was smelly, right? This was especially true in the outer courtyard, where the animals that were sold for sacrifice, and where the Greek and Roman currency could be exchanged for a half shekel to pay the temple tax. Animals would be slaughtered, right? Again, something most of us aren't that familiar with in our day-to-day lives, but it's a little bit different of an experience when they slaughter an animal in the courtyard. When I was in Africa, I remember spending a really long 3-hour ride in the hot sun in a car without air conditioning with a chicken that had been slaughtered and wrapped in newspaper And it really makes you lose your appetite over time. It's just like for me, I had to get my mind around it. Hard to eat that chicken. So you've got all this slaughtering of animals taking place, and the blood is running through channels to be washed away. So even though it was the norm, this whole animal sacrifice thing does turn my stomach. In Jesus's day, the temple was the designated place where people would go to encounter God. It was where sacrifices were offered. And Hollywood, as well as the other guys, we knew them as Matthew and John and Luke. They tell their versions of the stories. So all of them are telling the same story, slight differences, right? But basically, Jesus is angry with what he observes. Sometimes he wields a whip, going so far as positioning himself as a new way to God, a new temple. Sister of St. Joseph, Mary McGlone, suggests that the real scandal that Jesus caused that day with his, let's just call it his temple tantrum, was not driving away the animals and knocking over the tables to send the coins flying, but that he, a human being, was the new temple. Imagine the disruption that this idea posed, that an encounter with a human being might offer an experience of the real presence of God. Really? That God could be mediated through Jesus? I think if we reflect on that, we get a sense, we begin to understand the threat that Jesus posed. How grateful are we that all of our lives we've been free to encounter the sacred, the real presence of God, in silence, nature, art, music, dance, scripture, poetry, each other, community, family. Lent invites us to slow down and pay attention to how we encounter God and others. So we're almost halfway through our Lenten journeys. Today is a great day, certainly here in Drexel Hill. But it's a great day to examine how we're doing. Maybe even shift an attitude or behavior. As Jesus modeled, the key, my friends, is love.